Hey everybody, welcome to part 2 about the wedding that I went to in India. Now, if you didn't watch part 1, make sure you watch that. And even if you did watch part 1, if you haven't seen the other 2 videos on 5 things you need to know about India and not all Indians are Hindus, I strongly recommend you watch those videos now before you continue. All right, let's get to it. The wedding that I went to was a Catholic wedding because, as I mentioned in the video, not all Indians are Hindus, there are a number of Catholics. And so both the bride and the groom, even though they were of different nationalities, were both Catholic. So the bride wanted to have the wedding in the cathedral, and I have to admit, I think her choice was an awesome choice. The cathedral is absolutely beautiful, but you could not have an afternoon wedding in the cathedral. If she wanted to have an afternoon wedding, she'd have to have it in one of the smaller chapels on the same grounds as the cathedral, but she couldn't have it in the big cathedral. So, as a result, the wedding was at 10 o'clock in the morning. So, the photographers actually came to the hotel, her makeup artist came to the hotel, and the poor bride had to start at 6 o'clock in the morning. And then we were meeting downstairs, and I happened to be coming out at the same time that the bride was coming down. I actually came down the stairs, she came down the elevator, and the photographers were there, and they're like making me be in the video. I say photographers, but it was the photographers and the videographers. They were all part of one package, so they worked together. And so they were putting me into all the things. I told the bride, I'm like, well, you gotta be my friend now forever, or your kids are gonna be like, who's this woman in all your wedding photos? But anyway, so then we took 2 vehicles to the church, one for the foreign guests and one for the bride. The bride took a vehicle by herself because of her big dress. Now, she was wearing a not super large white American style dress. Matter of fact, she bought it in the United States, but she did have to be careful. The church in India will not accept anything that is strapless. I'm not even sure that it would accept sleeveless, and also nothing that would show cleavage. So matter of fact, she was really pleased when she was shopping for a wedding dress in the United States, and she met an Indian woman as a consultant because that woman understood the constraints that she had and was able to help her find a really awesome dress. So then when we got to the church doesn't have a lobby or anywhere else for the bride to go. And so the bride stayed in her car, and actually I went and joined her because it was so hot out and we didn't want makeup or anything to run. We stayed in the car with the windows closed. I sat in the front seat because there was no room in the back seat for me with her dress. And then when the groom arrived, I was also kind of hiding her from his view because she didn't want him to see him. She wanted a more traditional American, you can't see me kind of thing. But then she was kind of cheating. So then I started blocking him from her view as well. But I did notice that in the live stream, the cameras actually picked us up sitting in the car as they filmed the groom and his brother going in. Now, one of the funny things there is the groom was actually fairly late to the church, and it wasn't because he got cold feet or anything. The groom was staying in another hotel that night, and the hotel wouldn't let his makeup team and photographers in. They ended up getting into this big argument before finally the hotel gave in and let them in to do his makeup and take photos and whatnot of him ahead of time. So then a couple of things to know about the church. So in India, there are a lot of places where you have to take off your shoes before you enter. There are also a number of places where it's optional. Catholic churches are one of the places where it's typically optional. So at At the ceremony, a lot of people were barefoot, but some people had their shoes on. Actually, a lot of people still had their shoes on. I noticed all of the photography team, the photographers, the videographers, and the live streamers all had their shoes off. And then with the guests, I would say 10 or 15% of the guests took their shoes off, which the guests brings us to another unusual point. In the United States, the ceremony is the big part of the wedding. Matter of fact, I know I've gone to a wedding before and not gone to the reception. In India, it's the opposite. The ceremony is only for close family. And so this is why a lot of people are going to go ahead and have their ceremony in a smaller chapel, because they don't need a large cathedral when it's only family. Now, that having been said, only family, there were still, I would say, over 100 people there, and the bride only had 5 of them. So then for the dress, the local women, most of them wore gorgeous saris. According to the groom's brother, the average monthly salary in India is 40,000 rupees, but the silk saris that you buy for the wedding cost about 10,000 saris. So these are really expensive saris. Even though that's only around $100 US, to an Indian, that's going to be about a fourth of a typical take-home pay. So the women were absolutely lovely. Some of the young women were wearing dresses. Most of the girls were wearing dresses. But the women also had put jasmine flowers in their hair, and it smelled fantastic in the church. The church, as you look at these pictures here, you can see it's decorated very beautifully, but there are a couple of things to point out about these decorations. First of all, those streamers hanging were actually because there was a holiday shortly before this wedding, and so the church was decorated for that. Now, for the holiday, the church had also been decorated with flowers, but those flowers couldn't last, I think it was 5 days until the actual wedding, so there are new flowers that were procured. Now, these flowers cost 200 rupees per bouquet, which is less than $2.50. Now, again, for an Indian family, this may be expensive, but for the bride's American family paying for it, $2.50 for a bouquet of flowers is pretty wonderful. Now, one thing I should point out, in the last video, when I talked about decorating for the bridal shower, I mentioned that the decorator for the reception had decorated for the bridal shower. But he did not decorate the church, and this is because he's not allowed to decorate the church. So the priests are the only ones who could decorate the church. Another thing to point out about the church is it was very hot, and there were some portable air conditioners that were brought in, but they weren't working, and so it got really hot. The ceremony lasted about an hour. Now, according to one of the groom's cousins, ceremonies usually last about 2 hours. So this was a lot shorter of a ceremony. And the ceremony was also in both Tamil and English, which of course is also a difference, because most weddings in Tamil-Nadu are going to only be in Tamil. The thing is that some parts were in Tamil and some parts were in English and some parts were in both. So unless you spoke both Tamil and English, you actually didn't understand everything in the ceremony. Now, there were several things that were very different from an American ceremony, and there was at least a couple of things that were different from a typical Indian ceremony. So first of all, there weren't any groomsmen, bridesmaids, best man, maid of honor, and this is because typically in India they don't have these, and the bride with her family and friends coming from overseas didn't want to put that stress on anybody having to get the dress, bring it across international lines. I mean, even her parents having brought her wedding dress, they brought a steamer, but then the power converter for the steamer didn't work, and so then the steamer burned out, and so then the groom's cousin was searching for a steamer, and so, you know, you don't want to add this kind of struggle onto bridesmaids. So the bride didn't have any, so the groom didn't have any, although the groom's brother was dressed in a tie that matched the ring bearers. They used all of the groom's cousin's children and his brother's children as ring bearers and flower girls. I believe there were 9 flower girls and 2 ring bearers. They were absolutely adorable. Some of the youngest were under 2 years old, and so some of the mothers were having to help get them up the aisle. It was absolutely adorable. Another thing that's more typical of an American wedding that was found at this ceremony is, in addition to the bride wearing the white dress, her mother-in-law actually had wanted her to wear a yellow dress, I was told, is they did do the bridal march. Matter of fact, the day before the wedding, the bride and I were explaining to her sister-in-law about how the march works, that it's only played right as the bride's about to come down, and the bouquet, like passing off the bridal bouquet and then picking it back up. And so one of her cousins, because she didn't have any attendants, one of her cousins agreed to get that. Also, who was going to straighten out the train on the dress, because these are not things that are typical to an Indian wedding. Another thing that's not typical is, as I mentioned in the last wedding, most marriages in India are arranged. And so one of the things that's really a big part of an Indian wedding is a couple of months before the wedding, there is an engagement. Matter of fact, a couple's not considered engaged until they have this formal engagement. And at that formal engagement, that's where they exchange rings, which of course would mean that the ring bearers are also a little bit on the unusual side, perhaps. And so they did exchange rings at the ceremony, but then they also exchanged the more the more Indian piece of that, and that is gold chains. And so the bride's family had bought an expensive gold chain for the groom, and the groom's family had bought an expensive gold chain for the bride. And so they exchanged these as part of the ceremony as well. Some of the other differences include the fact that there wasn't 1 priest, but 5 priests. Now, this was a Catholic wedding, and I don't think I've ever been to a Catholic wedding in the States. So I checked with the bride. I'm like, are there usually 5 priests at a Catholic wedding? She's like, no, in the States there's 1. So there were 5 priests. There was a chair, there were chairs for them to sit down in. This apparently is a typical Catholic wedding piece because there's a mass, and so they sit down for that. But then some of the other things that were different was there were also altar gifts that were given. Matter of fact, the bride, the groom, the bride's parents, and the groom's parents all carried these gifts up to the altar. But nobody thought to tell the Americans about this, so neither the bride nor her parents actually knew that this was coming. There were several cases during this wedding where the groom's family was real rock stars because the bride's family didn't always know about some of the expectations because they're not Indian. And so these altar gifts were communion wafers, communion wine, and several different platters of fruit. And after the wedding, I asked one of the groom's cousins about them, and she told me that, yeah, those would then go to the priests, and they would be the ones to consume them, at least the fruits. I'm guessing the wafers and the wine were just later used in communion. As a Catholic wedding, this also included communion. However, one of the things that struck me, and I'm not sure the reasoning on this, is there was only the wafers passed out. Now, even the groom wasn't actually aware of that, because for the bride and groom, the wafers were dipped in the wine and they did that together. As a non-Catholic, I did not participate in the communion, but I was watching it and I'm pretty certain everybody just got a dry wafer. And then another difference was they had presents for the priests. Now, I've asked a few questions and I'm uncertain if this is very typical or this was something the groom's father wanted to do, but the groom's father went up to the microphone and he introduced each of the priests with a bit of a story about them, and then one of the family members would take the present to that priest. Also, the final big difference in the ceremony is that there was no recessional. So once they finished, they just started taking photos at the front and people just started to leave. Now, because the church wasn't air conditioned and the portable air conditioners that were brought in weren't working, and the fans were actually even really ugly and they'd originally gotten moved because they were not looking good in the photos, and so a lot of people were really hot, and so the other foreigners hurried out to the van immediately after the ceremony finished. And I wasn't ready to leave. I wanted to experience the rest of what was going on. So a little bit later, when I went out to look for the van, I discovered I'd been left behind. Apparently what had happened is the foreigners went out to the van and then other Indian family members just piled into the van until it was full, and then when it was full, it drove off. Now, thankfully, I'd gotten to spend quite a bit of time with the groom's family. I'd gotten to know some of his aunties, his cousins, you know, a variety of family members, and so I wasn't really worried about having been left. I knew somebody would find me a way to get to the reception. I couldn't do it on my own because I didn't even know where the reception was. Although I guess if push came to shove, maybe I could have, because I had data on my cell phone and I had the wedding website and it had the address for the reception. But I wasn't worried because I didn't need to do that. I first saw one of the groom's aunties and she was like, "They left you." I was like, "Yeah." She's like, "Don't worry, we'll get you there." And then one of his cousins was like, "Where are the others?" I'm like, "They left." She's like, "They left you?" I'm like, "Yeah." She's like, "Don't worry, we'll get you there." However, I was a little surprised on how I ended up getting there. At first, one of the aunties told me, "Oh, go get in that car right there where they were loading Grandma Patty and go ride with her." So I was headed that way when one of the cousins pulled me over another way and told me to ride in the car with the bride and groom. Felt a little bit odd, but they were in the back seat. I was in the front seat with the driver. And when we got to the reception, I wanted to get out ahead of them so that it didn't feel like I was going in with them. Although, as I learned, that really wasn't an issue because they didn't make the same grand entrance that I was accustomed to. So next week, I'm going to tell you all about the reception. The reception is where it probably diverged the most from what I was accustomed to. So make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you'll know when that video releases. And if you liked this video, please help me out by giving it a thumbs up. And until next week, goodbye.